Good morning, Eben. How are you?
I'm doing great, Renee. How are you?
I'm well. We're good down under here. It's late in the
Well,
day for
good.
you, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's kind of quitting time. It's 5:03 on a hot Thursday afternoon. But I'm happy to be here with you and in this beautiful conversation. I love the questions that your audience has come up with. They're wonderful and they show they're deeply engaged in the topic. So this will be fun.
That sounds good. Well, just before we get going into the questions, I'll just welcome everyone that's watching this question and answer session today. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Eben Alexander with us, who's been sharing with us his near-death experience and the nature of the afterlife. His story is crucial for many. It's just an amazing story to hear. And I particularly love that Eben envisions a more complete reconciliation, modern science and spirituality naturally. That's a wonderful vision, I feel, in going forward. So welcome, Eben, once again. Now let's get straight into our questions. So first one off the mark, and this is one that came up last week when we played our interview last week. What is meant by primordial mind?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. And, we go into great detail in Primordial Mind in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, especially chapter 5, which is all about the primordial mind. But the general idea is pretty straightforward. And that is that we all, as human beings, we think that our mind and our mental processes, our thoughts, our perceptions, our beliefs, our attitudes, our feelings, all that kind of mental contents of our inner space, we think that that's our private little mind. And, our conventional science believes that the brain creates that consciousness, that phenomenality, out of physical matter alone. And that's a really deep challenge to try and understand how that would even work. And that's why I think my journey was such a beautiful gift, because it really showed me the power of mind unfettered, no longer, imprisoned within the brain and body, but completely liberated. And so where this goes is just when you look at, for example, the life review in, life flashing before your eyes and near-death experiences reported for thousands of years across all cultures, what you find is that more often than not, they're described as a perspective of from non-self. In other words, people feel that they witnessed those events in the life review as if they were the other person, the one affected by your thoughts and actions. Even though the life review is very much focused on the events of your life, you don't perceive them necessarily from your own perspective, but more kind of what it felt like to others to be, on the receiving end of whatever you were handing out. And that's why life reviews are so important. But what they're telling us is the boundaries of self are not as solid as we like to think. And that in many ways, we're truly sharing the dream of the one mind, of this God force that, so many have encountered in NDEs and spiritually transformative experiences going back thousands of years, that feeling of love, of compassion, mercy, acceptance, oneness, togetherness, every bit of that kind of comfort and oneness comes from the deepest of these spiritual journeys. And then it turns out when you dive deep into the question scientifically about the brain-mind connection, you find that there's a lot of sense that comes out of this notion of the one mind. And that therefore we look at the brain not as a creator or producer of consciousness, but as a filter that allows in that primordial mind, that one unified mind, but lets it in such a fashion that it thinks it's kind of isolated. But it's not actually, and that's the part that's so exciting is, and then all of this business about consciousness and free will, all these gigantic questions start to line up in a more rational fashion. When you look at the brain as a filter, and this primordial mind is the consciousness that truly exists, and it is one that we share. And when we die and leave our body, we start to see those boundaries dissolve, and we start to become an overlap of mental space with other people. And there are many NDE accounts where you read about people like Jeffrey Olson is a great one, where after his horrific automobile accident, when he's been terribly injured and he's in the hospital, his mind is kind of wandering around and he's finding himself of temporarily, intersecting with these other minds. He knows other people's thoughts, and that's not an uncommon theme in near-death experiences. So where we're going with all this is this really this notion of that primordial mind that we all share. And that's where we realize we're in this together, and to hurt another is to really hurt ourselves. And that's why I think this notion of the primordial mind is so important. And as I think I mentioned during our session, BigelowInstitute.org, that's where those 29 papers live that tell you all about the scientific proof of the afterlife. And I love how Pim van Lommel, in his second place paper in that competition, towards the end of it, he develops fully and in a scientific sense this one mind idea in the scientific setting. And he uses 4 major examples from the scientific literature as proof and elaboration of that one mind hypothesis. One of those is Steve Taylor's book, Spiritual Science. One is Dr. Larry Dossey's beautiful book, One Mind, that is fully addressing this topic. Then there's also a paper by Bernardo Kastrup, The Universe in Consciousness, which I think was in Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2018. And then our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which has been endorsed by some of the leading scientists in the world of consciousness studies. From the Division of Perceptual Studies, Bruce Grayson, Jim Tucker, Ed Kelly have all endorsed Living in a Mindful Universe. Pim van Lommel, of course, endorsed it, as did Dean Radin for Poetic Sciences, et cetera. So all these people are scientists who are interested in the one mind hypothesis. And that's where it goes. And the evidence is very strong on this. We just need to figure out more about how exactly it all works. But it certainly opens up some tremendous possibilities in terms of overlap of our mentation and kind of the shared transformation of consciousness.
And hope. It gives us hope, doesn't
And
it?
hope, tremendous hope.
As beings on this planet. That's right. Because, I mean, we all know that one day we're passing, this body passes. And it just
right.
A hope that I often think people are looking for that all the time. So,
well, I think so, to know that it's not oblivion, that that's not what happens. And I think that part is crystal clear when you read all those papers at BigelowInstitute.org, is you realize that when people die, the thing that does not occur is oblivion, annihilation, nothingness, which frightens a lot of people. But it's astonishing to me how frightened some materialist scientists seem to be of, it keeps going, and we're responsible for our choices and thoughts and actions and all of that. And the answer is yes, we are. You're not going to get some break where all of a sudden you enter this gigantic timeout when your physical brain and body die. In fact, you're re-engaged in a much more full, integrated experience through this one mind.
That's right. And we're living in this ethical universe, aren't we? That's where it brings you to.
Absolutely. It is totally, a spiritual, ethical, moral universe. And although we think, humanity evolved all of its little concepts, as this little species of animals living on Earth, what you start to realize is, no, we're only sharing the self-awareness, the mindfulness of the universe. It's a property of the universe that pre-exists the Big Bang. But we are part of all that. And that's where this primordial mind hypothesis is so exciting and starts to answer so many questions.
Thank you. I think you've answered that very well. And actually, that was Ruth from Germany that asked that question there. Okay. Now, this next question is a little bit more complex, so I'll just give a little bit of background first. Stuart Hammerhoff and Roger Penrose in 2013 proposed that consciousness depends on biologically coherent quantum process in collections of microtubules within brain neurons, and that these quantum processes correlate and regulate neuronal synaptic and membrane activity. They even proposed microtubules vibrations as a possible source of the observed electroencephalographic correlates of consciousness. I got that out. Now to the question, can that theory be a possible bridge between the material physical world of manifestation and the immaterial world of consciousness, the mind-brain connection? Or is it another justification of the materialistic paradigm? Consciousness is a byproduct of matter. And this is from Jacques in France, a speaker from a couple of weeks ago. Okay.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you, that's a fantastic question. It really hits on a lot of the deep major points of this discussion. I think it's important anyone to realize if you study quantum physics deeply, what you end up discovering is it suggests that mind is fundamental. I mean, this is what Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, Pascual Jordan, I mean, all of them, all of the founding fathers of quantum physics in so many ways. We're talking about how consciousness is primordial. That is, this thing we call knowledge, phenomenal experience, in some way cannot simply be derived from physical matter here now in this locality. A huge part of the understanding comes from the non-locality of quantum physics, which is through entanglement, superposition, some of these concepts, but also non-locality of mind. All the findings in modern parapsychology supporting mind is much more than just some local event of the brain. And that includes things like telepathy, and there Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy is a very good starting point. All the work on remote viewing that I've discussed. And then, of course, near-death, shared-death experiences, psychokinesis, all of these kind of manifestations within parapsychology are indicators that mind is non-local. It's not just stuck here between my ears, but that my mind, through remote viewing, through telepathy, through out-of-body experiences, can come in communication with other minds at great distance and also across time. You're not just limited to a now. So absolutely central to the discussion is quantum physics. Now, a lot of quantum physicists don't know this and won't admit it because they think it's all just about the mathematics and just about, building the GPS circuit or the computer circuit, or the TV circuit, the calculator, what have you. And they've missed the fact that the experiments themselves, though, show us some fascinating kind of features of reality that suggest that materialism is absolutely wrong. And that consciousness is much bigger than just something that could be created, in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass sitting in my brain. Now, getting very specifically to this question, I will point out that in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we go into great detail in multiple chapters and appendices about all of this, and that's especially that quantum connection. And I will confess that when I was working on the book Living in a Mindful Universe in 2017, I still was not exactly sure how best to put together the notions of kind of quantum physics and mind and brain and all that. And I would say since that time, I've come to some deep realizations that help me to a much cleaner picture of it all. You can tell in the book Living in a Mindful Universe, we were kind of fishing for exactly what is it, in the kind of mind-brain connection where we can really define how these observations and demands of quantum physicists are actually kind of solidified in how they work. And that's where I was kind of fishing for it. Now, it turns out that what we're talking about in quantum physics is the measurement paradox, contextuality, which is kind of the mental set of the experimenting scientist sets things up in such a way that it determines what the outcome of the experiment is in a very powerful way, so that whether you're looking for wave or particle characteristics will actually determine the fate of the particles involved going all the way back to their origin. And this becomes especially fascinating in a discussion, say, of John Wheeler and his participatory anthropic principle and what's called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. I won't go into detail here. It is really deep and complex, but we do discuss it in detail in our book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, and including in the appendix. But I'm trying to get right to the Hameroff and Penrose conjecture here. And it turns out that the measurement paradox, which, as I said, is the central absolute kind of mystery of quantum physics, has at least 16 different interpretations. There are different ways of looking at the experimental results to try and make sense of them. You have the Copenhagen interpretation that Niels Bohr favored, and that's been kind of a dominant standard over many decades. But then you have many other possibilities in terms of explaining the measurement paradox. And it turns out that, from my point of view, the simplest and most powerful is Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but it's how things are dealt with relative to each other, and that the measurement has no value until it is taken. And when you get that bare bones view of quantum physics, I think it works best at then leading us in the right direction to understand all this. But also note that Carlo Rovelli himself does not go far enough. He reaches a point where he could go to the next level, but he's so much wanting to appeal to his scientific friends that he can't do it, and he doesn't do it. And it's really a shame, because going to the next level is very important. And that's where Bernardo Kastrup comes in very handily. Bernardo is another endorser of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. Bernardo has gained a lot of notoriety lately because he pushes in a hard fashion for objective idealism, just as we do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that this mental layer of the universe is ultimately what's in control of what emerges. Now, it turns out that Penrose, for example, has won a Nobel Prize. He's written about consciousness and physics going at least as far back as 1989, when he wrote that beautiful book, The Emperor's New Mind, which I highly recommend. And Penrose has written a lot of other interesting stuff since that time. One that is an all-time favorite of mine is called The Large, the Small, and the Human Mind. And it's by Penrose, but it's also commented on by some brilliant people, including, and I will say the least brilliant of the group, is Stephen Hawking. So that gives you an idea. Abner Shimoni, other people, you'll see if you read that book, just an astonishing discussion of this. It really points out how deeply quantum physics is absolutely tied to any kind of modern notion of consciousness, of computability, of our deeper understanding. So Hameroff came at it as an anesthesiologist, and he was the one who brought the notion, well, maybe, because many people talking about this, my group, others, are all crystal clear on the point that quantum physics is a deep question around brain-mind connection, but trying to make sense of it all. And Hameroff approached it saying, well, these quantum states could actually be maintained long enough in microtubules that they could participate in the kind of time scale that we're witnessing for human cognition and human consciousness. And I think that they're right. I know Max Tegmark, for example, has argued against them. He thinks, mathematics is the pure basis of all this. And he's said that Hameroff and Penrose are wrong, that you cannot maintain, avoidance of decoherence is basically what we're talking about, long enough to be involved in human cognition. anyway, the deep answer to this question goes way, way down in there. The answers come out of it mainly through living in a mindful universe and a lot of the arguments we make there. I would say that Hameroff and Penrose, from my perspective, are very much on the right pathway. I think they've identified in microtubules a way that this giant field of universal consciousness could interact locally with the brain as a filtering mechanism. So, Hameroff and Penrose might well be on the right track with that. I'm not convinced that all the answer is right there just with microtubules. And the appeal of microtubules is that they do seem to host an atomic environment, molecular environment that would enable protection of these systems so they don't decohere and lose their quantum information with contact with the rest of the universe. But anyway, we could go way into this for hours, but it's an excellent question. And I can tell you this questioner is right on the heartbeat. Quantum physics is totally at the core of the mind-brain connection in a very deep and profound fashion. Understanding the mechanism of that is what I'm interested in doing as a neuroscientist. And microtubules are probably part of the answer, but I also think that confinement of ions and ion channels, for example, as Henry Stapp, who's a renowned and very respected quantum physicist, he's written about this extensively, and how Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is very active right there at the ion channel in the neuron. And so neurons are essentially pure quantum computers. Don't even begin to think that they would work like a digital computer and have Newtonian deterministic kind of inputs and outputs. They are working with ions and ion channels tightly confined in location, therefore meaning that the momentum vector is wide open. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I think that Henry Stapp's work about ion channels and synaptic vesicles, these are all kind of the playgrounds of the atomic world and of quantum physics. And then it could be, especially as we come to understand more about brain and mind and how they work, how space and time work, how mass and energy work, because those are all deep mysteries in the physics community even now. But the more we discover about all that, it might well be that our concerns about decoherence in the warm, wet brains, say in ion channels or synaptic vesicles, where you're not necessarily protecting the quantum nature of the information as tightly as you could argue you are in microtubules. But I think all of these are wide open to discussion in terms of how they contribute. But the thing that is absolutely beyond debate is that the discussion of brain, mind, and consciousness is completely, absolutely, and totally a discussion about quantum physics and the world of subatomic and molecular and atomic realm. So that's where the big answer to your question lies. And there are other quantum physicists who are deeply involved in the question of brain-mind connection consciousness. So not just Henry Stapp and Roger Penrose, but Brian Josephson, another Nobel laureate who's written about this kind of thing extensively. That is the primacy of consciousness. Also Minas Kafatos, Claude Swanson, I'm trying to think of the other names. There are a few others. They're kind of slipping my mind at the moment. But Amit Goswami is another one of note. But Jude Currivan has written a lot about this. So much of the world of people interested in quantum physics who know enough about consciousness realize that's right at the core of the brain-mind connection. And quantum physics is it. I just don't know if it's all microtubules or if we also need to consider that decoherence might not interfere with the quantum state so quickly in some of these other environments, in the dendritic tree, in ion channels, and in the synaptic vesicles. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
Hopefully, I'm sure Jacques will get a great deal from that. This must be quite exciting for you to watch this unfold. This
it is fascinating.
Yeah,
it's an exciting time to be a neuroscientist interested in brain-mind consciousness, realizing that materialism is long ago dead, and there are some profound abilities of human kind of manipulation, mind over matter, especially in terms of healing and all that kind of thing, which I know we'll get into in the next few questions.
Yeah. Yep, that sounds great. Okay, next one is from Sue in the Hawke's Bay. For me, my question is around the term self-healing that you used. I have looked into this a little from the perspective of emotional healing. Your journey with this came from completely within, as you weren't here. So it was all happening to you and through you. But for most that are sick, to heal is a conscious thing. Now, to the question, what do you know from your journey is necessary to heal ourselves from an illness?
I think what is necessary is to basically kind of recover that sense of love and wholeness, that we have meaning and purpose and connection with the universe at large. And so what Karen and I often talk about is in meditation, putting the little ego voice into timeout, because that's not who we truly are, getting into that touch with the higher soul and the primordial mind. We can do that through meditation and by leaving the ego voice behind. And what it involves is just simply coming into wholeness and seeing ourself related to this universe in a loving and perfect fashion. And in that way, we appear whole. We do not appear infirm with various, kind of illnesses, addictions, toxicities, what have you, but really kind of come into this oneness and wholeness of perfection. I like to think of the world that we witness when we die, that near-death experience, death experience, what have you. That world is in many ways like Plato's world of ideals, where our life review happens. The life review is in the setting of beautiful, infinitely loving God force, and yet we go through the events of our lives, and if we were selfish or greedy or what have you, a lot of that could just look horrible in the brilliant light of love of that realm. And yet it shows us that we are children of that. And the more we can bring that light and love into our being in this world, in these lives, every moment, and not just towards the end when we're dying and leaving the planet, but that's what allows us to come into wholeness in this existence. And that's where I think we can come into wholeness and healing and away from dis-ease, away from any kind of disharmony. And that's where meditation and centering prayer is so important, because these are ways for us to get centered in the moment, in the day, in the activities of our human lives, and start to really see that wholeness through love, the binding force of love. And the more we can see our relationships, self to the universe and self to all others, as one of love, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, acceptance, mercy, then that's when we start coming into wholeness in our own being. And that's where I believe that toxicities, addictions, illness, dis-ease, every bit of that starts to fall away, because it no longer fits our kind of natural wholeness. And this is where I would say that all people need to know is just pay attention to near-death experiences like mine, Anita Morjani's, Mary C. Neal's, and Jeffrey Olson's, and others and others and others. Learn more about them. And what you'll see is capabilities for healing, tremendous capabilities for healing. When people come back from these things, they end up becoming more whole. And what that means is the imperfections and the addictions and the toxicities and the egocentric corruption, every bit of that starts to disappear and is no longer making us less than, the soul of love that the universe created and brought here in the first place. For us to evolve to that state is what our existence is all about. And so I would say that wholeness and healing come from the same origin. And that's all we're trying to do, is become more whole. And so this healing is a very natural state, but it involves our deep exploration of our relationship with the universe, and with even coming to a deeper understanding of our very purpose for existence. But in this bigger theater of operations, that's where we're able to come into wholeness and bring healing into our lives in this incarnation.
It shows the importance of our choices, doesn't it, that we make as individuals?
Absolutely does.
It really comes to the fore there. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Our beliefs and attitudes attitudes are so crucial because they influence every bit of this. And the more we can adopt that loving, all-inclusive, caring, take care of others approach, the more the universe will take care of us.
And you mentioned about reading the various near-death experiences, etc. And in actual fact, the more we get in touch with those or hear a first-hand experience, in actual fact, hopefully we may not need to have that experience to develop the attitudes and to move the mindset, really, isn't it? It's
right. I would say that's very much
using
the
what's
case.
there. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And we'll be covering this just as a reminder to your audience. This is exactly the kind of thing we're going to go into in detail in our workshop that we do on September 10th. Yeah, 10th for you and 9th in the United States. But people just pay attention to EbenAlexander.com, and we'll be putting out notices for that. But that's exactly the kind of, this self-healing and this notion of wholeness and through meditation and connection of higher soul and the primordial mind. That's absolutely what we'll be covering in detail at our workshop in September.
That
so
sounds
looking forward to that.
I know there's a lot of people looking forward to that. So that'll be great. We'll have that up online, which by the time this airs on Sunday will be online and people can book that directly. So that's wonderful.
Good. Excellent.
Okay, thank you, Sue, for that question on healing. Now, Susan Kashula from Christchurch in New Zealand. In light of the current US Supreme Court's ruling on criminalizing abortion, my question to Dr. Alexander, from his understanding, how do you view abortion? And I realize this could be a slightly controversial question here, but yeah.
It is, and I will tell you, within my own kind of mind and self, it's also a bit controversial. So it's not like I'm going to give you some final answer, but what I will share is, first of all, I know, just as the BigelowInstitute.org papers point out, as our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, points out, Proof of Heaven, every bit of this, I know our souls are eternal and interconnected. I know this as a fact. I don't need any proof about it. But the essence of that is to realize that when somebody dies here, when a human being dies in this planet, their soul and their awareness does not come to an end. Okay, that's point one. Point two is, I believe from my journey, it was crystal clear to me that homicide is absolutely a violation of so many of the deepest principles of that spiritual realm. And I would say suicide in many ways is also, except in cases of interminable suffering. And in cases where suffering, physical, mental, emotional suffering from a disease is so bad and cannot be alleviated, I think that euthanasia can be a proper approach. I will also say that for all those who are worried about a loved one who may have committed suicide and hitting big trouble when they get to the other side, the answer is no, they don't. What they find is that suicide was the wrong thing to do, and that in fact there was a tremendous amount of love for them here all along. And I know that because I know of studies where people who tried to commit suicide and failed, but had some element of an NDE, connecting with souls of departed loved ones, with a loving, infinitely powerful God, what have you. If they had those pieces and then they came back to this world because they failed to kill themselves, they don't try suicide again. Okay, that's simply a fact from people involved in the therapeutic world who study these things. So in other words, the NDE shows you that suicide is the wrong answer, but it's not as if you're punished in some way for that suicide. It's just that you realize that now you have to repackage those things in a next life and go through them again and hopefully satisfy them more completely than you did before. But in other words, homicide and suicide in general are wrong. And then when it comes to abortion, I was adopted. I know from meeting my birth family and hearing that story, only a few years ago, things I never knew way back in my youth and never knew, like even at the time when I wrote Proof of Heaven, had to do with the fact that, that my birth mother had a potential access to an abortion in South Carolina. It would have been illegal, but potentially that was offered to her. But my grandmother and birth mother decided not to go that route. And I'm glad they didn't. I know some people who have been adopted will claim, well, adoption was a rough road. They were never born. That's not my approach at all. I love life. I'm greatly appreciative of the life I've had. I realize that the abortion was a tougher challenge than many people might realize. And that also played out in a tough old way, even in the last decade or so, as I met my birth family and got to know them. And I don't have time to go into that, and I won't go into it. But the bottom line is I'm still very conflicted on all this. I know it's, from my point of view, it's criminal that the Supreme Court has made this judgment. There are many times when women who have tried to use birth control, et cetera, have a child. The child is unwanted because they cannot afford it. And I think that the Supreme Court is totally out of touch with reality by banning abortion. I think women's health is an important thing, and women should have the choice in their own body. And when I hear of these cases of rape and incest that are not allowing an exit ramp of an abortion, I'm like, what do these people not understand about reality? I think that is just cruel, and it just shows our Supreme Court has lost its mind. I won't go into it in any more detail. I mean, but a lot of their recent judgments are purely political. They're steps 50 and 100 years into the past. I think it's an absolute anathema, and I think that the United States will come up with a far better solution than this idiocy of having a bunch of old men telling women what to do with their bodies. Forget it. That's absolutely wrong. And so, yes, I have a lot of feelings about abortion, but I think the Supreme Court's decision on this one is a giant step backward and a big mistake.
Yeah. Thank you for attacking that question and just bringing a different perspective for us. So that's great. We've also got Brian Kushula, Susan's husband. He has sent a couple of questions in. Heaven is believed by many out-of-the-body authors such as William Buhlman as a place created by thought forms in which disincarnate souls are locked into a narrow version of reality. When traveling out of the body, William found that these souls mostly refused to leave heaven in spite of being bored and disappointed with it and realizing that there is much more beyond heaven. Is the belief system of heaven limiting the soul's growth? And then I'll ask the second one here. With increased use of out-of-body methods, is meditation being replaced?
Not at all. I think part of this, of course, would have to do with somebody's definition and what their personal experience is involved in terms of, heaven, some kind of afterlife, a spiritual realm, what have you. And I know William Buhlman, I respect him very much for all the work he does in out-of-body experiences. I think he's been a great teacher. But no, what I can tell you is the spiritual realm is so vastly, infinitely more than anything anybody's ever experienced in an out-of-body experience, period. To experience everything outside of space and time, all of eternity, infinity, as I did in the core, is something that goes so much farther than any kind of meager out-of-body exposure. NDEs, from my point of view, are gigantic, in-your-face examples of the much bigger universe we live in. I think out-of-body experiencers do glimpse a little bit of that. They can certainly get a taste for non-local consciousness and the experience of bilocation or multiple location, et cetera. But to pretend that out-of-body experiences will replace the spiritual journeys of NDEs and these profound adventures that involve the God force in its fullest form, as NDEs do not think that any of that will be replaced by out-of-body techniques and out-of-body efforts, because they are kind of like psychedelics. They're a glimpse into the world, the full-born world that's shown to you in an organic, natural, near-death experience. So it's a similar territory, but it is not the same thing, and nowhere near the same scale and scope as a true NDE. So meditation is here to stay. Meditation going within for me, is a form of centering prayer. But absolutely do not dismiss meditation at all in terms of journeying into spiritual realms and also into the non-local aspects of this universe.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Brian. I hope that answers your questions there. Now, our next question is from Esther from Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Esther says, I'm interested in the psychedelic research and that the mind goes black. I wonder what the long-term effects of that black mind are in Eben's findings. Does the paranormal experience fade with the frequent use of these aids, become addictions themselves, even those the magic mushroom cures addictions? Question. And can these shortcuts to lift that veil into other or real realms be achieved with meditation? Eben mentioned sound, that lower receptor of the brainstem, that ancient part of the brain. Very interesting. Mantra chanting comes to mind. And my question, why in Theosophy we don't use them, given Sanskrit is based on sound vibration?
Well, a lot of interesting points here. And it's a blank mind that what they're seeing, what I described are the scientific experiments using functional MRI, magnetoencephalography. These are very kind of detailed ways to look at neurons, look at the nerve cells in the brain, and look at their activity and their big network connected activity. And the interesting thing is several of the major networks that we think are involved with, kind of the sense of being and sense of identity, especially one known as the default mode network, basically disintegrate under the influence of these serotonin 2A type psychedelic substances. And to me, it's fascinating that there was a beautiful essay written in response to that first paper by Robin Carhart Harris that came out in 2012, and that was in Scientific American by Christopher, I guess it's Christoph Koch, Koch. He's the head of the Paul Allen Neuroscience Research Center in Seattle, very respected neuroscientist. But he said, guess what, people, your brain on these drugs goes dark. He was as shocked as anybody, as I think most materialist scientists were absolutely shocked by this. But in other words, if you're looking to the brain and neuronal activity and trying to explain these phenomenal experiences under the influences of these plant medicines, stop, because the brain goes dark. You have to look elsewhere. You have to look in the spiritual realms. You have to look into the phenomenal mental space of the universe. That's where you'll find whatever it is that leads to kind of causal effects in those areas. Now, there are other little sub-questions in here. Does the paranormal experience fade with frequent use of the aids? Well, I think it does. Like so many of these substances, there is a certain process by which repeated usage, they have less power to them. But nobody's gone so far as to follow the functional MRIs, magnetoencephalography, et cetera, to see what happens in those cases. But I think the more important thing is to realize, and this was from those other papers I mentioned about the addictions, of fear of death, all that being cured with 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin in a proper therapeutic setting. And that's where I think, from my point of view, meditation will be a far more powerful way to get these kinds of effects. Because I think that's all you're doing with 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin anyway, is thinning the veil enough to allow that higher soul communication so that one can realize that they have that love of the universe and they no longer need to do this ego thing of being an addict. So it's an ego disease, ego toxicity. And that's what we're really talking about in all these things, is trying to get beyond the ego in terms of knowing what our self and our identity and our consciousness and our awareness and all that truly, takes us to. What are the limits of that, if any? And this is where I think that the meditation would do a much better job in terms of giving us that benefit of alleviating the fear of death, addictions, all those ego diseases. And that's where I think the meditation, that's why I'm trying to come up with the protocols to assess that using sacred acoustics meditation and compare that directly with those kinds of substances. And just to point out, we go into a lot more detail in Living the Mindful Universe about the neuroanatomy that is discussed there. And the point I was making is that most of the sounds you've ever heard, chants, anthems, hymns, what have you, that might have engendered a transcendental state of conscious awareness, they're all being processed up in very recently evolved circuits up in the temporal lobes, in the acoustic cortex. Very, very different from binaural beat brainwave entrainment, sacred acoustics, and other forms of binaural beats. They're all processed in circuits in the lower brainstem that arose more than 300 million years ago. And again, I think that's where the real extreme power of differential frequency brainwave entrainment comes in, is by intersecting consciousness at such a deep level in terms of anatomy and evolution, is what allows our conscious awareness to be set free from the illusion of here, now, and sense of self. And that's where those binaural beats can be so powerful. And if you go through the testimonials page on sacredacoustics.com, you'll start seeing all the many, many ways that people are gaining power from this kind of thing. I know my older son, Eben IV, who's now in his third year of postgraduate medical training to become a physical medicine and rehab doctor. But he listened to Delta, of Sacred Acoustics Delta, while studying and while doing other kind of activities of mental function for more than 70 days over the last year or two. He's listened to these tones a lot, and he uses them to help get into this kind of deep space of conscious awareness that enhances his memory function and all that kind of thing. He's just putting it to very practical use. But I can tell you that Sacred Acoustics is well worth investigating. If you want to do creativity, if you want to do connection with departed loved ones, et cetera, if you want to heal self or others, Sacred Acoustics offers a lot of tremendous tools for doing exactly that.
I'll just add something to that. The Sacred Acoustics, I did download this week some of the Sacred Acoustics from Karen Newell's site, and obviously you helped Karen with that, Eben. Right. And it's just amazing to listen to that, take the time, center and go there. I think it takes you there in a fast way rather than having to move yourself out of the mind. You just get into that mode. So sound.
Well, we normally don't think of sound as being powerful in any way, but you bet. Sound can have tremendous power, and especially when it's used in this very specific way to kind of detach conscious awareness from the lower brainstem and from the here, now, the body, sense of self. Every bit of that disappears as we expand that conscious awareness.
Yeah, I noticed that last part of the question there from Esther, where she talks about, where are we? About theosophy. Why aren't we doing more in that sound space? Just a reminder that the theosophical teachings don't actually tell each of us what practices specific we have to do. They bring up meditation. But each of us is very, very unique as individuals. And so that's why the Theosophical Society can't adopt one particular way because of all of our uniqueness. So it's up to us to find that way that works for us. And sound is so powerful. So I don't see any thing against sound whatsoever. I think what suits the individual. So I'll just add that to there. So thank you.
Well, that's a very good point.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I might just swap these last two questions around because this next one that I'm going to share is a little bit more about the brain paralysis. And since we're kind of on the topic there, this one was actually from me, this question. In theosophical teachings, the mind is dual in its function, but not in its essence. And for the lower aspect of the mind to be reunited with its parent source, HPB, she speaks of the separative mind needing to be paralyzed so as to remove the restrictions or blockages. And that's the, for example, involvement and identification with the desires and emotions, etc., that we all get caught with. You mentioned previously that your experience was in a setting of amnesia and that this prevented you from dismissing the story. What did you mean by this? Can you speak further to this, as it seems to be a paralysis of types for you to have brought back fully the experience that you had?
Well, one thing I'd like to say in terms of the amnesia is it was an absolute brute fact of my experience that I had no knowledge of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of Earth, this universe. I really did start with an empty slate. And that's atypical for an NDE. And yet I came to realize, especially after my coma, when I wrote down everything about my own NDE before I read anybody else's reports, then read all those other reports, started to realize the similarities and overlap. The amnesia was really a gift, because I came to realize if I had scripted my NDE, first and foremost, my adoptive father would have been there. He passed over 4 years before my coma. Very important in my life. And for those who've not only read Proof of Heaven, but especially the sequel to that book in terms of my personal experience, and that's the book Living in a Mindful Universe, I tell the story where I actually did encounter my father 2.5 years after coma in deep meditation. And in that encounter, he made it clear to me that there was, he said, in fact, it was his sense of humor came through in that vision, in that 2.5 year post coma meditation experience, because he said he could not be a parent to me during the NDE, a parent, double entendre, a parent being, he couldn't be my parent, and also he couldn't be seen by me. And the reason for that is if he had been my guardian angel, as opposed to the spiritual guide I had, that beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing, in spite of the fact that this was a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningoencephalitis in an adult, in fact, in spite of the fact that it was a 1 in a billion recovery, I mean, my full recovery is made clear in that case report, and in Proof of Heaven is really unprecedented in medical literature. In spite of those rarities, if my father had been the one there to guide me through the experience, I think I would have been more tempted to dismiss it as you see who you want to see on the way out. The dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. And I would have let it go. That's very different from what actually happened. What actually happened was I had this amnesia and this mysterious young woman on the butterfly wing. And when I came back from the coma, I knew her so well because my mind and hers had been joined multiple times in this beautiful conveyance of the message of being at home, the spiritual home, loved and cherished forever, nothing to fear, deeply cared for. Every bit of that deep truth from her was so reassuring to me. And yet, when I came back to this world and then started reading that NDE literature, I realized, well, wait a minute. She's supposed to be somebody very important to me in my life. I know her deeply from the experience, yet I have no idea who this person is. And that's what I was left with, for several months after my coma, because I had no idea who she was. And yet I knew her so deeply. And for me, it was almost a complete game changer, almost dismiss every bit of it. None of this makes any sense at all until I got that picture as described in the book, Proof of Heaven, at the end of the book, that came 4 months after my coma from my birth sister, Kathy, who I had just met about a year before my coma for the first time in my life. And she had promised me to one day send me a picture of Betsy, of that sister who had passed over 2 years before I even knew of her existence. I'd learned of her existence in the year 2000. that sent me into a dark night of the soul because it was a perceived rejection from my birth mother. But the important thing to note is that having her be the guardian angel, because once I made that connection, and I describe all that story perfectly at the end of the book, Proof of Heaven, wow, was that an eye-opener. And that showed me the reality of the journey. It explained why it was way too real to be real, because it really happened. And in a realm that was much more real, detailed, and kind of memorable and impactful on our lives than this realm is. So that is kind of the essence of the story of the amnesia.
It just lines up, doesn't it? It lines up.
It does. It lines up beautifully. And the whole thing then starts to make sense, where it didn't make much sense at all. Now, and you're talking here of the separative mind and the paralysis and the restrictions and all that. I think what we're doing is we just have a difference in language between things that I might call primordial mind and kind of our ego self, our ego mind in this body, in this existence. And for me, the interesting thing was that, in looking back on it all, I felt like I was being driven around on this. It was not my free will that was driving the events of my coma journey, but I was being shown it kind of by my higher soul. And so I think that this whole discussion of the separative mind and the paralysis, the restriction, might be better explained kind of in my terminology, where it was just that higher soul kind of taking charge of a lot of what was shown to me and demonstrated. And that includes the ability to ascend to that highest level of all, the sanctum sanctorum of the divine, the core realm, where I witnessed the whole higher dimensional multiverse collapsing down into this complex oversphere throughout all of eternity, infinity. And if that's the kind of setting for one's mental space, I hope you understand how grand and the possibilities are endless for what can be demonstrated and elaborated there to help us in this process of soul growth. So that's why the meditation centering prayer is so important. Start developing your relationship with that realm now. Don't wait until, when your body and brain are dying. Yeah. That's absolutely the wrong time to be discovering that the whole universe is spiritual and that we're spiritual beings in it, and that our whole reason for existence here is to make progress along those spiritual pathways. And if we've wasted our whole life with this materialist nonsense, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, then what a disappointing moment when we leave the physical world and realize our existence is much grander than that, physical body was. And that now, all you're really doing is kind of hoping to make a much more progress in your next incarnation. So anyway, learn the lesson now.
Exactly. Thank you. You answered that well. Now, our last question actually comes from a lady in Vienna, Wei Wei, and she has been connected with both Singapore Lodge and the French lodges as well. So her question's quite fascinating. So I'll go through this story and question. I was brought up in communist China in an atheist family. Life after death was not believed or talked about. When I was about 13 years old, I had a death experience in a dream. In this dream, I fell from the 5th floor and died instantly. I then floated above my body and saw people panicking around my body, but wanted to tell them that I was well alive. Then I started to fly up across different layers made of different substances. Crystal clear water-like substance is one layer, for example, and saw wonderful and beautiful creatures along the way, until I finally reached the layer where there is this bright white light, but it does not hurt my eyes. This light is alive. I knew that this is home, although there was nobody telling me that. I just understood. It is a place full of love, life, safety, and trust. I have nothing to worry about. This deep experience marked so deeply in my memory that for years I could not forget it. In my 40s, I started to read theosophical literatures about the David Chanic plane and people's near-death experience and noticed the similarity. My question is this just a coincidence that I had a dream that looks like a death experience, or could that be a past life memory of a death? Or I traveled in my dream to another realm and brought back the memory. But in this case, why did I need to die in the dream in order to go to the other realm? I appreciate your input.
I think the reason she needed to die was to realize that death is not the end of conscious awareness. And I mean, this is a beautiful story. She had a near-death experience, and it might easily be a past life memory of a near-death experience from another lifetime. I don't know, maybe. I've heard hundreds of those kind of stories. So yeah, this could fit right in with that. So beautiful. And it kind of makes you wonder, you know, because I'm sure there are a lot of stories in China, just like there are a lot of stories everywhere about these kinds of things, about people having after-death communications, et cetera. And it just shows you how the cultural beliefs in many ways can be either very restrictive and confining and kind of preventing us from knowing truth, or they can open up and allow us to know far more. And that's why I'm glad what I'm seeing in our Western culture now is this incredible revolution in the scientific community about the nature of consciousness. I think it's going to absolutely change the game here, because so much of the trouble in our modern world is from this false sense of separation, you know, from materialist thought that has been disproven in the scientific world for more than a century with the advent of quantum physics. So I hope that, you know, the Chinese people and people around the world can wake up to these deep truths, because they're an inherent part of who we are and how this universe operates. And the more our cultural beliefs can align with something that appears to be deep truth for individual journeyers, I think that the better a service it does to this world to have that kind of knowledge be what is shared, you know, in our in our communities and in our civilization. There is no question in my mind that this revolution is going to have tremendous impact on the world. It will unite it. And when I say this revolution, I say the primacy of consciousness, this understanding of primordial mind, of that God force as being right at the core of who we are. I think the whole world is going to change for the better. And certainly, you know, when I look at the way religions have behaved, sometimes they've behaved beautifully and followed the message of the prophets perfectly, but most of the time they really haven't. And so I'm glad that it's really the scientific community that will end up leading the way in this revolution, because it's really scientific fact about the brain-mind connection and the nature of reality that we can kind of tease out of all this and start to make sense of what is true and what is not. And I trust that there are many other stories like this one that exist within China. And the more this kind of literature and this discussion and this narrative and these possibilities and these stories showing the tremendous amount of healing and wholeness that can come in people's lives when they wake up to this kind of deep truth and see that they have will over this. You know, that materialist science is scoffing at you if you claim to have free will. They say it's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain, an illusion of conscious awareness, pay it no mind. Well, that's the exact opposite of where I would say this scientific revolution is headed, where choice and, you know, our free will decisions and how we behave, how we act, every bit of that has a tremendous impact on kind of our soul's progression and transformation. And it is time for this world to wake up to this deeper and more profound truth, really just to save ourselves, if nothing else, because this pathetic, bleak, and paltry fiction of materialism is leading us down a pathway of death and destruction, mainly in the form of corporate greed, climate change, buildup of carbon dioxide, our addiction to fossil fuels. Every bit of that is an absolute crime that it continues at the levels that it's continuing. And for example, the decision today by the Supreme Court in the USA to restrict the Environmental Services Agency from being able to regulate companies in their production of CO2 is a horrible step in the wrong direction. Another example of how our Supreme Court has become completely not only useless, but dangerous. And we really need to adjust this court in some fashion, because it's leading to the destruction of the very best principles and ideas in the United States.
Thank you. It really is onward and upward, isn't it, on the journey, though, in terms of there's hope, there's the potentiality for every individual. I mean, that side sort of shines through, and you're shining that light on that, which is wonderful.
I think there is tremendous cause for hope. And yes, I'm very optimistic about the future, but it has to do with an absolute 180-degree flip in our world from this crazy worship of materialism to a much more broad quantum-informed view of consciousness as involving all of us as here to help each other.
Yeah, yeah. I've just realized I left one question out, so I don't know whether you noticed that, but I just looked back and thought, and it's one that kind of fits in nicely here anyway. It's question 3. It's from Ganesh in Auckland. Somehow I skipped over that. He says, in theosophical literature, we've come across a statement that states that the life and consciousness are the same, as viewed from 2 different aspects. As a medical doctor dealing with life of patients, and as well as a neurosurgeon associated with the consciousness aspect, we would much appreciate of your views or comments about life and consciousness. Now, I know we've touched on these. Is there any final comments around that you'd like to?
Well, yeah, this is a great question. And it points out to me, there's been a movement in the last few decades of biocentrism. I know Robert Lanza has written extensively about that. To me, it aligns beautifully with a lot of what we say in Living in a Mindful Universe. And really, this whole idea of biocentrism is simply pointing out, if we agree from this discussion, what I'm arguing is the mental layer of the universe, that is primary, and that the free will of the universe, essentially, which sentient beings can gain access to, is all about life forms. Life forms are what show this kind of property of consciousness. Now, we look around our world and we see a lot of living things and we see a lot of non-living things. But I think every bit of it exists within consciousness, within that primordial mind. So in so many ways, this is about consciousness being much more fundamental. It's something that we associate with life forms. And we say that life forms, are conscious. They have this property of consciousness, of being self-aware. But I think that the deeper answer is that consciousness is much more fundamental, and we see it as life. I mean, we see living forms, but never forget, and this is where some people get confused in the modern era, and they think that an answer like panpsychism works. Panpsychism, again, that's something we discuss in Living in a Mindful Universe. Panpsychism it's basically almost a purely materialist idea, but it admits that in the study of mind and brain, that we must confess that there are aspects of mind that seem completely above and beyond anything that could be produced by brain. And that's something that Wilder Penfield, the renowned Canadian neurosurgeon, noted so well in his book in 1975, The Mystery of the Mind, where he was pointing out that you cannot explain all of consciousness and mind from everything we know about brain. There's something more required. And I think that that's a very important point. And what it is really showing to us, though, is that consciousness is the thing that exists. And once you've experienced this world and also multiple spiritual realms, you realize that we have different modes of consciousness, but that the worlds that we witness in those different modes can be radically different and apparently not necessarily so connected. I mean, that the life review of the Gateway Valley, that's a much more kind of integrated, whole life, completely packaged unit of kind of assessing the events of my life, the potentialities, and where it can all learn in terms of my learning. But I think this may sound like kind of a convoluted answer, but what I'm trying to say is ultimately it all exists within consciousness, within that one mind anyway. And we're just trying to discern more of how we have influence on that. And that is where all this talk of healing and health and wholeness comes in very handy. But I think ultimately it has to do with free will, and that ultimately what we're coming to discover is we have a tremendous power of will over our emerging reality. And that starts with our health. And it has to do with this notion of objective idealism, the mental layer of the universe. As I said, years ago, scientists said, well, wait a minute, consciousness only came into existence in the universe with humans in the last, few 100,000 years, et cetera. But what they're missing is, that we borrow conscious awareness from the universe itself. It is a property of the universe. And that is something that we come in touch with when we touch the non-locality of consciousness through telepathy, remote viewing, these visions and near death, shared death, et cetera. All of this is about touching that bigger world of consciousness. And especially when you realize souls of departed loved ones are one of the most universal ingredients in NDEs across all cultures. Read Gregory Shushan to learn much more about all of that. But really, it's just showing us the continuity of soul, the importance of our relationship with loved ones, that we're all in this together. We're all co-evolving. I look at us as co-creators with that God force of our emerging world. And that's really where this kind of deeper understanding of life, consciousness, free will, all of that kind of bubbles up to the top.
Yeah, it shows the importance of every single life, doesn't it? Like when you...
It really does. And Karen and I often like to remind people, no soul left behind. Yeah. Every single soul is crucially important in this. But, it's a beautiful, wonderful, deep dive of a journey. Don't just sit there and think you can sit in your armchair, think about this for a few minutes and figure it all out. This is about devoting your life to really getting deeper into your relationship with the universe, spending a lot of time in meditation, a lot of time witnessing what you can accomplish through meditation, and also the kind of insights that you can bring back to this world to help in your living every moment and every breath of this life with your fellow human beings in a way that makes sense to you when you come to your deathbed and leave this physical body once and for all.
Yeah. Thank you. Very, very insightful. Every single response to all of the questions. So that really brings our time to an end for now. So just reminding everyone, 10 September for the 10 or 9, depending on what part of the world you're in. And we'll have that up online. And just deep thank you from all of us, from our hearts. And I thought just the very last thing I'm going to ask you to just remind everyone the most important message you brought back from your NDE. I thought I want to finish on that, how deeply we are loved, isn't it?
Loved. It's all about love. And I don't think any near-death experiencer would try to argue otherwise. I think they will tell you that's what it's all about. The Beatles knew it. Dionne Warwick sang about it. But now we can all come to know this very deep and profound and important truth for humanity to learn, especially at this juncture in its destiny.
Okay, thank you. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for taking the time out. We've done 2 weeks in a row, and I'll see you in September, and I'm sure we'll chat at some point before then.